So this is not something you have to do, but it just illustrates the point that if you're looking at the measures, they should align in some way. They should add up so that you're not seeing someone who's high on one and low on something else. So we also know that other test-based growth models like value-added Colorado growth model and so on do not answer to everybody. This 69%, by the way, was based on one state, but it's sort of the quoted number that everybody thinks about now. But it was only based on one state. In fact, the states that I've talked to say it's closer to 75% of their teachers they don't have tests for. Yeah.
Does that mean if that's all your kids?
Well, what it's saying is if you have value added as your measure for all of your tested subjects and grades, that's only going to be about 30% of your teachers. The other 69 to 75%, you do not have value added for. So these are ones that can't be tested, and Lynn talked quite a bit about this. I'm actually just going to follow up on a couple of things that Lynn said that I was wanting to talk about, sort of some very recent thinking around the models of how we might do this moving forward. So let me review the models with you. The only difference between, well, I think I may have put these in a different order than Lynn had them. But this subject and grade team models here, this is the one I'm now calling Ask a Teacher model. This is the one that's basically focused on teachers meeting together in grade or subject-specific teams to consider and agree on appropriate measures. The real advantage to this is that you get comparability. Because what I'm afraid of happening is you have teachers who set, maybe a very discouraged teacher who doesn't think their kids are going to be able to learn anything. So they set low objectives and they use a poor quality assessment, maybe a teacher-made assessment that nobody but that teacher uses. And then in another classroom, you have a teacher who believes all her kids can learn. She sets very high objectives. She uses very high quality assessments. The results might be that the one with the low objectives meets the objectives and looks good and gets a high effectiveness score. The one with the high objectives and the high quality assessment looks bad because maybe though her kids achieved fabulous growth, they didn't meet those objectives. So what we need to focus on is not having teachers isolated in their rooms determining what measures and objectives to use, but having a much more collaborative model. So many of you are talking about using student learning objectives. Fine. If you want to go that way, I understand why many states are choosing it. One of the primary reasons is it's basically passing the buck. I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. The states say, we don't have the capacity and resources to do some complex thing. We're just going to let the districts handle it. So the districts say, get told, you're going to do SLOs. Okay, fine. The district looks around and says, we don't have the capacity or resources to do this. We're going to let the schools handle it. And so then the principal gets told, you're going to do student learning objectives, along with the observations and everything else you're doing. And this is exactly what's happening in some places. So, for example, the Rhode Island model, I'm concerned about the principal burden there because they are doing the observations and they're meeting with the teachers to do student learning objectives at the beginning of the year, at the middle of the year, and at the end of the year. They're expecting the principal to know art and science and math and music and PE and all of these things to a level at which he or she could determine that's an appropriate objective and that's a good assessment to use. I don't think it should be left up to the principal to make that determination. And I don't think most principals have that capacity or the time to do it well. So what worries me is that the principals are going to do it badly. They're going to just wave their hand and say, okay, fine, I'll take your word for it. And what we're going to get are results that are meaningless in terms of helping us actually identify who your good teachers are and who are your teachers who are struggling. So that's why we need to be thinking about a hybrid model, which is a hybrid between these two models here. And so the MBPTS task force recently recommended, they have a set of recommendations, but I particularly think this one is applicable to this conversation. Employ measures of student learning explicitly aligned with the elements of curriculum for which the teachers are responsible. This recommendation emphasizes the importance of ensuring that teachers are evaluated for what they are teaching. So this basically says, School-wide value added, which is what some states are using, supposedly as an interim measure for all of the non-tested subjects and grades. No. For many reasons. Not just because the recommendation from the experts. The expert panel, by the way, is people you've heard of that made this recommendation. It's also a matter of making sure that if I'm actually wanting to know, are my kids learning biology? I want to know that they're learning biology according to their content standards for that grade level. I don't want them to get, for their score, 50% the reading and math teacher scores. That tells me nothing about the biology teacher. Here again, this could be someone who looks great during the once-a-year observation, and the rest of the year she's showing videos. You wouldn't know, would you? Because they automatically get 50% of their score is somebody else's score. They had, you know, and the argument here is, well, but they're going to be aligned with the math teachers. They're going to, you know, be teaching math and biology. No, not so much. They've got their own standards to teach. They've got their own curriculum. If they teach math, that's in the service of teaching biology. It shouldn't be because they're trying to get a better value-added score for the math folks. See what I mean? So we need to be concentrating on measuring teachers in their content and subject and grade level, not on a measure which they had nothing or very little to do with. So concerns about SLOs, this is the hybrid model that I'm talking about. Rigor, comparability, and administrator burden. The rigor issue is, you know, you have teachers who don't believe their kids can learn. They may not be setting high enough objectives. They may not be believing those kids can achieve them. Rigor can be handled to some extent with a rubric. Austin does what they call a rigor rubric, where they actually will look at the teacher's objectives and say whether or not those are appropriately rigorous. I don't think it goes far enough. The rigor rubric, to me, actually needs to be more developed because I don't think it goes far enough in actually making sure that the teachers are teaching to high levels and high standards. But the comparability issue is one that I worry most about, because if different teachers are using different tests and different types of measures, some are making them up, some are using commercial tests, some are using the ones that came with their curriculum, some are using a project, and others are using an assessment of another kind, some are using essays, but their scoring rubric is different than the teacher next door, then the results are going to be meaningless. So the idea is to get teachers to think about what are the measures that we could all agree to use, and to use measures that are agreed upon. So if you use student learning objectives, think about how we could move that system towards greater comparability. Now that may start at the school level. It may start at the district level. It's much harder to do this at the state level. But that's the direction you want to move. Eventually, what you would like to see is that all of your 7th grade social studies teachers in the state use the same measures. But that may be difficult because in many local control states, every district gets to pick their own curriculum. And they may have different curriculum materials, different tests that came with those curriculum, and they may say, we want to use the pre and post test that came with our curriculum. And if another district doesn't have that, then that couldn't be the choice for the entire state. So I think it's hard to move towards a state system. Start small, start making sure that you've got comparability within the school, making sure that you have comparability then across the district, then think about comparability across the state. So the other thing that it can help with is the administrator burden, because the teachers do a lot of the scoring. Now, can you trust teachers to score? I would say 99% of the time you can. And 99% of the time, they know a hell of a lot more about it than their administrator does. You know, unless it's their administrator subject that she taught when she was a teacher, chances are the teachers know more about it. So getting them to agree to use particular assessments and then working together. Let's say you've got a writing rubric. So all of the teachers agree to use the same prompt at the beginning of the year. Then they get together and score the results, and they agree on what's a 4 and what's a 1. Because one of the big problems is if they all use the rubric, but they all have different ideas of what a 1 and a 4 is, you're still going to get different results at the end of the year in terms of who's effective. So having them agree on the scoring rubric and how it's used, and that can apply to just about any subject where there's a rubric for a performance-based subject like art and music and things like that. The teachers who are doing that need to agree on what a 1 is and what a 4 is, what's the appropriate evidence, and what does that evidence mean. So this is an example of Rhode Island's model, and I just want to show you this because we have student learning rating, professional practice rating, and professional responsibilities rating, so they have 3 things in their system. Their student learning rating is 51% of their system, but they've divided it into 3 categories. So category 1 is student growth on state standardized tests. So this is something that all of your tested subjects would have. Category 2 is student growth on other types of standardized tests that might be used at the district. So those of you who are using NWEA's MAP, this would be that kind of test because not everybody's using it, but many districts are. Category 3 would be other local school administrator or teacher selected measures of student performance. This is the part that we have to worry about in terms of thinking about getting teachers to agree to use the same stuff so that we get greater comparability. Rhode Island, as far as I know, does not have a plan to ensure that. I hope that they do before they implement it, get a plan. Now just a couple of more slides and then we'll have time for questions. Consider whether data accuracy, rostering is key, and completeness are sufficient for teacher evaluation. If you've got a teacher with, in a school with very high student mobility, they may start the year with 20 kids, and they may end the year with 20 kids, but they're 20 different kids. You're not going to be able to do value added with that teacher in any meaningful way. So you need to be thinking about some of the rules that you're going to establish to make sure that you're actually doing this well if you're using tests. So rules might be how many total and or consecutive days a student should be on a teacher's roster to count. Tennessee has a rule about that. A couple of other places that are using value added have a rule. So the idea is you've got to pick a number and say, if I want to count that a teacher has influenced the kid and has contributed to their learning, this is the minimum number of days that they have to be in that classroom to count. How many verified student scores are sufficient for determining a value-added score? So this is the idea of if you've only got 5 students, that is probably not sufficient. You're probably not going to be able to do value-added for that teacher. How to handle missing data, prior test scores. One of the big problems with doing value-added, especially with very disadvantaged kids, is they are missing test scores, lots of them. Now, if everybody was sort of randomly missing test scores, that'd be one thing, but there's a huge population of kids who are very mobile, who are in and out of school, who don't have test scores. And for those kids, it's much harder to get the data that you need to do value added. Whether to use a single year's value added score for teacher evaluation or something like a rolling average. And as I showed you, there's quite a bit of research saying you don't want to use a single year because of the instability of that. And how to count students who have multiple teachers for a tested subject, and I pointed you to that research by Hawk et al. That's the best research that I have found on dealing with these special circumstances. And as he said in that research, 21% of the math kids in their study in Washington, D.C. had more than one math teacher in a year. So a lot of student mobility, but also things like team teaching and resource teachers, teaching with a general ed teacher. So there's lots of ways to have that situation, but you need to get with your value-added people and make sure that they are figuring out a way to handle that. And lastly, develop a communication strategy to increase awareness and buy-in. This is so hard for teachers. I spend a lot of time working with teacher unions, NEA and AFT both, to try to help their members get a handle on this and understand what's happening to them, because that's how they feel. This is happening to them. They don't feel that they really understand it or have a voice in it many of the times. Even in states where the teacher unions are at the table, they feel like they don't have sufficient understanding or influence on the decisions that are being made. Establish a plan to evaluate measures to determine if they can effectively differentiate among teacher performance. This is really crucial. You've got to have a dynamic system, a system that is always thinking about, is this the right measure? Is this actually giving us information that is valid and can help us distinguish among those teachers who are high performers and we want to acknowledge them, and low performers and we want to help them or counsel them out of the profession if they're consistently low performing? And then examining correlations among measures can help you do that. Evaluating the processes and data each year and make needed adjustments. One of the problems is if you have a measure that you're not getting valid results, it's a widget effect and everybody's getting good or great, the first thing you say is, it's a bad measure. Well, this happened with Charlotte Danielson's. Charlotte Danielson's measure was used in the widget effect report. And so looking at that and saying, oh, well, it must be a bad measure because everybody's good or great. No, it could be poor training because people don't agree on what good and great is. Here's an example of that. Los Angeles Unified invited me to do a presentation for them, and there were 200 or so people in the room. These were teachers, administrators, union members and representatives, researchers, school district personnel, school board members, so lots of people who know a lot about education. I was asked to talk about observations and validity and issues on observations. So what I did was I talked to Charlotte and asked her permission to use one of her components. I showed a video of a teacher teaching, and I asked the folks to think about one particular indicator, and I said, think about whether this teacher's a 1, 2, 3, or 4, 4 being the highest, 1 being the lowest. I showed the video again, just to make sure they had in mind the indicator, what they were looking for. And then I asked them to raise their hands. How many think this is a 1? And I got about 20% of the hands raised. How many think it's a 2? About 30%. How many think it's a 3? About 30%. How many think it's a 4? About 20%. These are people who would tell you, I know good teaching when I see it. But clearly, they have a different understanding of the evidence and what it means in terms of a score. They all saw the same teacher. They all had the same set of indicators on the same instrument. But they had different ideas of what that meant. So the point is, it's not enough to say, it must be a bad measure, I'm going to reject that one. You need to think about the training that went into using that measure. If you've got something like an observation, if you are not training your folks to use it to a high degree of agreement on what it means to be a 1 or a 4, then you're going to get results that are not going to tell you anything about teacher effectiveness. They're going to tell you you need more training. So that's the part about evaluating processes and data. Publish the findings of system and measure evaluations. There are things that DC Impact did wrong, and I think one of those was to implement the system in the fall and fire teachers in the spring. But there are many things that they've done well, and one of those is the transparency of their system. They have a handbook for all 20 of their teachers types, including their counselors and various other combinations, itinerant English language teachers, all sorts of things. They've got 20 handbooks, which are very thorough. They have the entire rubric that teacher will be judged upon in those handbooks. So transparency I like. The other thing that they do well is they publish their value-added stuff. So Mathematica writes reports on their value-added results, including that report about the teacher, multiple teachers per kid, and they publish those. So I think it's really important that there be some transparency with these issues. Now, the next bunch of slides, these are places you can learn more about growth models of various types. The one at the bottom is Colorado Growth Model. The others are all variations of value-added models. Evaluation system models. Let me make clear that I'm not recommending these evaluation systems, but what I'm saying is they're well developed enough that you can actually see some interesting things in them. We have our very own Georgia sitting nearby. And I love the Georgia rubric, but it's, last I saw, 100-something pages. And so it's not practical in terms of using it in a classroom for a principal to go and do an evaluation with. So I look forward actually to talking to Georgia and hearing what they're doing with that now. But what I really love about the rubric is it is incredibly thorough. And I especially like the last few pages that deal with the student achievement piece, because I actually use those in presentations when I talk about states who are saying, how do we combine all these scores into something meaningful for a teacher? I say, let me show you what Georgia's got, because I really like what they've done. Hillsborough, Florida, they're making tests for all subjects and grades, but so far I haven't actually seen any tests coming out of that. New Haven, Connecticut, they're the ones with the matrix, but they have a pretty well-developed system. So I'm not picking on these systems for any reason other than they're fairly well-developed, so you could look at their language, look at ideas from them if you wanted to. And then tons of references. As I said, they each have a link. Most of these are freely available on the web. And as I said, these are the top people in the field who are doing this research, so they're worth looking at.